Hi there, welcome to lesson 1.3. Today's lesson focuses on Australian land use and soil destruction. We'll look at the principles of how soil is destroyed, and we'll look at in detail how we actually use the Australian landscape and demonstrate it through maps that indicate the entire continent's use and what are the primary ways we use the land and how that affects it. So we will concentrate on agricultural use, of course, because that's mostly related to soil, and how majority of the landscape is actually under grazing and majority of that is under cattle grazing. So we'll focus on that industry to demonstrate some principles about destruction of soil. And also we'll look at the environmental impacts of our food choices and how we can make different decisions in terms of the impact that we individually have on our food preferences and how that can actually change the landscape in which we are in. And also look at some future predictions of what happens if things don't change and how that might affect us if things continue going the way they are and if we continue to destroy our soils. Okay, so let's jump into lesson 1.3. So basically, how does soil degradation occur? What are the steps that happen? Well, firstly, usually it involves the removal of native vegetation. And remember part 1 of lesson 1, we looked at how biota or the biological systems are tied up with vegetation directly, all the microbiology on the roots and requiring that root feeding. So therefore, when we remove vegetation, we also lose soil life and convert, as you can see in this image, the soil to dust. So, of course, tillage destroys soil structure because it further degrades and exposes the organisms, breaks them down and exposes them to oxygen and light, and they're supposed to be deep in the soil. So that really means that we lose the topsoil. And of course, in addition to that, as weeds start to grow, to start recovering the land again, we use chemical herbicides and we need to add chemical fertilizers in order for our plants to grow because the microbes are now missing, so they cannot feed our plants like they normally would. So all of that kills soil microbes and causes weed proliferation. And any time a soil is left bare, it's exposed to erosion and drying and microbial death and therefore desertification. So we're turning our soil into desert basically without plant cover and with killing of all the microbiology that's in the soil. This is an interesting image showing what happens when we remove vegetation and how that's very much directly related to the lack of rain that we experience in this country, because where the rabbit-proof fence is, it actually demarcates a very nice line where the vegetation has been cleared for farmland, and that's on the left. You can see that in the image here. And then you've got the rabbit-proof fence, and then on the right, you can see cloud formation. So there's obviously a correlation between rain and the moisture that plants basically produce, especially forests, and then generate a cloud cover and bring rain with that. And of course, fungal spores and other things are in there as well, helping to generate that rain. So you can definitely see that vegetation is present, soil is healthy, moisture is condensed in the atmosphere, and clouds are formed, and therefore not as much heat is generated, and we can survive into the future. So let's have a look at what Australian land use looks like. So this is a very interesting website to visit. It's called climateworkscentre.org, and it leads you through all these maps to show you exactly how Australian land mass is being used and how that relates obviously to climate change and everything else. So one thing to point out straight off is that about 55% of the land in Australia is covered by grazing animals. So basically that vegetation is continually being removed, grazed. There's no option for native vegetation to even really come up. It's very difficult under the current systems that we have in how we graze the country. And basically that's just the majority of the landscape right there. The green bit, which is supposed to be conservation, you'll soon see that it's actually in the middle of Australia where there's desert. So really very little of our forest is actually protected to actually do the work that it does in keeping the country cool and creating oxygen and sequestering carbon, because that's what forests do. And then the very ambiguous part is the 17% where it says other. That's usually mining and other activities, not very described in these maps. And cropland is only 4%. of horticulture, and that includes a little bit of fruit and vegetable farming. Majority of that is actually grain, which majority of that is then fed to cattle. And then there's forestry, which only takes up 2% of our land mass, and urban engagements are only at 0.2%. So we're not really removing that much land for probably urbanization, although it seems like it because we all live on the coast. We're really just grazing the land to oblivion in this country. So, and I knew that from when I started my agricultural science degree in the first year in economics. That's what we learned, and I had a problem with that. And the more I learned, the more distressed I became. And it's a very big cow in the room to talk about these things in Australia. It's not considered to be part of the discussion in any circles. In fact, on climate change discussions recently in Edinburgh, Australia didn't put their hand up on reducing methane emissions and didn't want to talk about animal production as a problem in producing greenhouse gases or anything like that. But this is the map. So that's all of pretty much the country is entirely covered in agriculture except for a few bits. The middle bit is basically just a desert. So we can't really do much there, and that keeps increasing as we graze the edges. So that's a problem as well. And then you can look at this entire map now, and the grey area, as I said, is actually a grey area, the really dark one here, because that's actually used for mining, most of it, and it's desert as well, mostly. And this is, even though it's green, it's actually desert, and this is what we call conservation. So that's a problem, a very big problem. And then everything that's grey is cattle grazing, and everything that's yellow is cattle grazing. So we have the entire country covered in hooves and methane producing animals. So this is why this country is as the way it is, in how dry we are and how difficult it is to get rain, especially like when you just get out a little bit out of the coastline, like I am past the ranges. Rain is very, very scarce, and this is mostly an agricultural area that I live in. So forestry, as you can see, very little. You can hardly see the little bits that we mostly complain about. The big bits that we don't talk about are what happens across the majority of the country. And cropland and horticulture, as you can see, very little uptake, but very intense. So I'm not dismissing any of this, and majority of our lessons will be focused on food production in terms of plant food production and how bad that actually is and how we can change that to get the country back on track. But we need to do that across the entire continent, not just in the tiny bits that are in purple here. So yes, this will come up again, but livestock grazing on modified pastures takes up 70% of the intensively farmed agricultural land, as you can see here on those edges. And then grazing on native vegetation occupies more than half of total land mass of Australia, and the rest is desert pretty much. So that's just to show you that same map and where our actual desert country is. Probably not very accurate in terms of, it's probably like a simple map, but we know that Central Australia is desert, and it's really hard to do anything there other than conserve it, because there are obviously species living in there that need conservation, but really the reason for that is because there's nothing else we can do in that land. So this is just a map showing us that livestock grazing on modified pastures, so obviously all of that, and modified meaning obviously native vegetation has been removed and only introduced species are grown. Very little of our native species actually exist in those pastures. In fact, they have been reduced from 400 species of Australian native grasslands to maybe 4 or 5 that we graze cattle on. So the biodiversity has dramatically taken out a lot of carbon and moisture out of the atmosphere and life, really. So that's, once again, that region covers over 70% of the intensive agricultural region. And you can see that majority of that is cattle grazing, and I think probably 50% is actually exported to other countries. And so what that means is really we're taking out all of our carbon out of the soil, all of the nutrients basically being mined by cattle, and then that's being sent off, while the methane that they produce is actually left behind on our continent. So that's a very sad story. And I know our chicken consumption is increasing in Australia, but cattle grazing is increasing as well at the same time. And so this is the breakdown of how that industry looks. And this is once again that like half of the Australian landscape being covered by grazing and native vegetation. So what this actually means is that while these animals that are not native and have hooves and are plant-eating machines, they literally remove any seedling that comes up and destroy the landscape, introduce weed. And there's a literature review done that I can share, because it's really worth reading the scientific analysis of what that actually means for future of our country in terms of recovering the landscape and our forests, really. This is interesting, like just how putting them together really would mean having the entire pretty much country besides the desert grazed. And so this is figures from the Department of Agriculture and Food, Western Australian Government, and this was figures from 2013 that we had 29.3 million head of cattle in the country, and majority of that, 50% almost, is actually in Queensland. And interestingly enough, 85% of land clearing also happens in Queensland, and that's 55% of Australian rainforests exist in this region of Australia. So basically, we're clearing forests to graze, and on par with how Brazil's doing that to the Amazon, we are exactly the same. So we're doing the same thing, but we just don't really talk about it. And you can see that those figures very nicely here. We produce 2 million tonnes of beef annually, grazing 28.8 currently million cattle as of this year. And that's predicted to rise to 29.6 by 2025. And that's the highest since 1970s. So we keep consuming, keep exporting, and keep grazing, and keep cutting our bloodline, lifeline, which are the forests, for doing this production. So it correlates very much with our wealth. America and Australia are the leaders in beef consumption. And this is just a figure of how much meat we eat per year, 121 kilos. China is interesting, this was quite interesting to learn, has increased their intake to 60 kilograms of meat per year since 1998. So obviously, as we have more money, we want to eat richer foods. And this is a luxury because most countries can't afford to eat meat, especially beef. So like India only consumes 2.2 kilograms of meat per year, and then you've got Ethiopia at 8 and Nigeria at 7. So these people can't afford to eat the way we do, but we definitely can. We are very rich, and don't let anyone tell you any otherwise, because there's actually a whole study that asks, are we approaching peak meat consumption? Analysis of meat consumption from 2000 to 2019 in 35 countries and its relationship to gross domestic product. It's actually an Australian study. And if you're really interested in this as well, have a look at the UN's Livestock Long Shadow Report, which was written in 2006. And they're basically saying all this stuff about how if we don't curb or actually completely get rid of meat production, especially beef, we have no hope of survival, really. And the reason why it's such a huge problem in this country is that we have very delicate soils to start with, but they weren't delicate because if you look at the actual reports of white people that first came and documented what was happening in the landscape, you could put 2 feet worth of a stick easily into the ground. And basically, that's like 60 centimeters going into the ground easily. That's how amazing the soil was, because it had 400 species of pastures of Australian native grains that Aboriginal people were producing and feeding off and harvesting. So we've basically grazed all that out, converted into meat and methane, and damaged the soil severely because, of course, the hooves and the weight of these animals, which are not naturally supposed to be here, have huge compaction effects. The soil structure is destroyed through the hooves as well. Obviously, grasses are only grasses where there's vegetation that's way higher up the ecological scale that we could grow, and that would actually increase carbon sequestration. So grasses can only do so much, and I'm not dismissing native grasses, but we just don't have those native grasses to sequester that carbon. So this is basically what happens in the end. The poor cattle are just starving, and we have to bring in food from elsewhere to feed them, and it's really sad, really. Also, there's a plant selection that happens because with the introduced cattle were introduced grasses, so native grasslands have been destroyed. And the native seed bank, if anything does try to come up, it basically just gets hammered by these animals. These grasses are not adapted to being grazed by these animals. And of course, methane production is a huge problem. I want to also say that I do appreciate that with cell grazing or timed grazing, there is going to be a difference, that it is an improved way of grazing. There are different methods of doing it, and there are definitely methods that are worse than others. However, what I am saying is that as long as that landscape that is under grazing systems of any kind remains, whether they're even improved systems, while the land that is supposed to hold biodiverse vegetation, particularly trees, while it's kept constrained, because we want to continue to take from the land, it is not going to have the same effect as if we returned to some sort of a biodiverse ecosystem. And at this point in time, we're in such dire consequences of the continuous exploitation of the land that nothing else is going to actually make that change for us unless we seriously consider converting a lot of landscapes into food production within ecosystems. Ecosystems have to be present that are biodiverse, that hold biodiversity, that bring species back. We're at a point in time where species extinction is like en masse. And without other species, we cannot survive. We can't just sustain ourselves on one species, which is the cow. We need everything else to be in place. And you'll see how biodiverse it is in the soil. And we need that above ground. That biodiversity in the soil is going to represent what is happening above ground. And it's just impossible to sustain ourselves if we don't actually drastically move Australia towards a very biodiverse ecosystem. And that means in the soil as well as above ground. And that means drastic changes in the food consumption, drastic changes in our desire, willingness to return nature back so it can feed us, so it can nourish us, so it can let us breathe, let us have rain. This is the sort of stuff I'm talking about. So while there are different types of systems that can be implemented to improve the grazing situation, the fact remains that while we want to increase beef production particularly, but also other animal production, we are never going to come back from this disaster that we've created. So I'm not saying that there aren't better methods. I am saying that we need to actually go beyond, way beyond that, and think outside the box, think beyond the cow, think beyond the monoculture. We're going to have to move that way, and we're going to be forced to eventually if we don't do it willingly and embrace the process. And this is what happens when we overgraze. We remove the top so much dramatically, continuously, that we just have no root. And of course, the microbes die, so they can't produce the effects of sequestering that carbon and holding moisture and holding the whole landscape. And as a result, we have huge erosion issues in Australia. Very, very serious. It's a very serious problem, and you can see that. And I won't give the stats here, but the statistics of how degraded the landscape is are pretty sad. Also, soil salinity occurs as we remove native vegetation and crop it or graze it. These shallow-rooted plants that we choose to grow basically bring up the water table, and that water table dumps salt on the ground. So this is a huge problem. And the same goes for acidity. It's a huge problem in Australian country where it's just been basically mined to the maximum, and acid soils with aluminium are very common in the landscape. One interesting thing I found was as well, obviously it's an inefficiency because the plants that we eat are being fed to cattle, but also pollution. Pollution is a huge thing in terms of methane, so that's climate change, but also other things like in feedlots. There's horrendous problems with organisms that are very detrimental to our health being formed, like viruses and other very huge problems, but also eutrophication of the environment through pollution as a result as well, that breeds these anaerobic organisms that then are detrimental to us. But between 2005 and 2014, what was interesting, Americans for some reason cut their beef consumption. And what that was equivalent to was the emissions of 39 million cars being taken off the road. It's just a very interesting way where we put our preferences in terms of what we believe are the biggest problems, because we want our cake and we want to eat it too. But 1 kilo of beef equals 26 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions. And these numbers are all throughout the scientific literature for us to look at. And in that time, what happened was Americans consumed 19% less beef and reduced climate warming pollution by 185 million metric tons. And that equates to that number there, the 39 million cars. I just love these little conversions, and that goes for everything, not just with this particular topic. I just think putting things in perspective is a really nice way of educating ourselves. Because of the huge impact that our food choices actually have on the environment and the degradation that agriculture can have on and has on the environment, on the soil, on the atmosphere, on the waterways, on the oceans, scientists are looking into how to improve the situation by studying various dietary preferences of the population in order to encourage change in society so that we can actually reduce our impacts on the environment and on climate change. And one of the most recent studies, which literally came out exactly a month ago, done by Oxford University and interestingly Griffith University as well, is involved in that study. It's an impactful study in that it has taken into account a huge cohort of people, over 55,000 individuals across 38,000 farms and 119 countries. That's how the data has been collated. And the title of the study is Vegans, Vegetarians, Fish Eaters and Meat Eaters in the UK show discrepant environmental impacts. But the study actually looks at way more than that and actually divides the levels at which people are consuming meat and comparing that to all the other diets, which is fantastic because then it comes up with really great data sets that can be compared and people can make choices as to what kind of impact they want to have or not have on the environment. So in the two tables that you can see here, they looked at the vegan, the vegetarian, the fish eating preference, low meat eaters, medium and high meat eaters. And they compare the carbon dioxide emissions from those diets, the methane emissions from those diets, and nitrous oxide. And then in table 4 on the bottom, you can see that they looked at actually how the land is impacted in terms of land mass used to support people consuming the different diets, how much water each of those diets use, how much pollution is created, so that's the eutrophication of waterways, and also the biodiversity impact, so species extinction per day based on what diet you consume, based on your food choices, your food preferences. So what they found was that vegan consumers contribute 25% greenhouse gas emissions of that contributed by high meat consumers, eating over 100 grams of meat per day. Vegan consumers use 25% of the land and 46% of the water required to feed people consuming high meat diets. And vegan consumers are responsible for 27% of the eutrophication or pollution caused by high meat consumption and impact biodiversity in terms of species extinction at 34% of the impact of high meat consumption. And overall, vegan diets were associated with less than half of the impact of high meat consumer diets for all the indicators studied, so for all the environmental impacts they've looked at. But the interesting thing was that for greenhouse gas emissions, eutrophication and land use, the impact for low meat eaters was at least 30% lower than for high meat eaters. So there is a distinction, and it is worth thinking about just even a reduction in the foods that you consume that have these now very known and science-supported facts about their impact on the environment. So definitely individually as a society, we have choices to make. And there are some countries that are moving towards that, like for example, Germany, where plant-based diets are the go and the governments support that. And it also increases people's health. There are studies showing the health effects of those diets as opposed to meat-based diets. And there's so many benefits to be had if people realize that it's individuals that make up that choice. And various countries are actually going forward towards a plant-based diet, understanding that it is impossible to sustain our current Australian standard and American standard diet. It's just not possible to sustain, and it's just causing more and more degradation and extinctions and all these awful things that we're experiencing at the moment in this world. This is also just to show you the other land use that's the biggest compared to animal grazing. So the second biggest is production of horticultural products. So majority of that is actually, as you can see here, over 45% is cereals, barley and wheat, and 40% of that is given directly to cattle, and we're actually running out of grass to feed cattle naturally because of climate change and how much we've overtaken through grazing. And so basically a lot of our cattle end up in feedlots now. This is definitely the same scenario for America, and this is going to be a prediction for Australia. Cows can't survive on the grasses anymore, so they're going to go into feedlots. And 2% out of that entire production system of agriculture is used for fruits, nuts, vegetables. And these are the only crops actually really, besides some good grain crops, where we can lead the soil restoration into that area. We can't do it with cattle. I'm sorry, we just can't. I know that's a very unpopular thing to say, but if you just start studying this and looking at the science, it just doesn't add up. And we need to literally change our food preferences towards a plant-based diet if we are to restore soils to feed ourselves and to conserve our biodiversity, which is so obviously important to sustain our own lives. Every time we remove biodiversity by clearing, we are dying. We're chopping our own body parts, so to speak, out of ourselves, really. So this is the way that it is. And there's a lot of different production systems. Like, for example, I studied the cotton system because that's hugely dependent on water being flooded, and that's hugely problematic as well. But look at the percent of that compared to the entire country, where each cow drinks 100 liters of water a day to sustain itself. The maths doesn't add up as to how we actually view everything because of how the land mass is being used. So we need to look at the overall picture and not just go and gang up on something that's smaller. And I'm not saying none of these industries definitely need improvement. There's definitely huge, horrific stuff happening. I won't go into it now, but you can, obviously, if you're interested, you'll look that up for yourself as well. There's a very, very interesting study related to this that I highly recommend reading. It's called Reducing Food's Environmental Impact Through Producers and Consumers, written in Science Journal in 2018. This was like a whole world study showing no matter how wonderful and regenerative it seems that our animal agriculture is, they've shown that the worst possible vegetable production or cereal production with the most heaviest pesticides and everything else still didn't add up to the environmental degradation of converting plants to meat. Very interesting study, very nice to read and find out what it actually all means and how it looks. So I invite you to read that for yourself. But fruit and vegetable production can be used to, and grain as well, to regenerate soil and our health. And so this is where we have potential to extend that area and actually feed more people, because obviously the land is less intensively used as a result, and way more food can be shared than just a few kilos out of an entire cow that takes so much land to grow that animal. So it's all about economics in terms of how the food is produced and the resources it takes. It's all about resources and the depletion of the soil. And we can use these plants to actually put soil microbes back in the ground. And we'll go through that obviously in future lessons. But so this website that I've spoken about right early on with the mapping systems, where it shows you how Australian land is used, they say that by 2050, it is estimated the global population will reach almost 10 billion. That's almost 3 billion more mouths to feed and lifestyles to support without significant change to consumption patterns. It's estimated that food production may need to double to meet such demand. At the same time, climate change is likely to affect agricultural production in some areas through changes in temperature and rainfall patterns. And of course, the more we destroy, the more we stay in the same systems that we're using, the less likely we're going to reverse this climatic change and problem that we're facing. So the changes and challenges are that Australians' land use is changing, with competing demands adding greater pressure to our landscape. So looking ahead, this pressure will only increase. But this is our choice, and this is a choice we need to make individually. And it's shown scientifically that our food choices are the biggest way we can actually change that. So many countries are already subscribing to this. Lots of people are moving on this because they're researching it and the governments are saying it. And in Australia, we don't really hear about this much, if at all. So that's something that we now know and we can pass on to our mates and we can make those changes. And I believe it's possible to do. We can all do it. We all have that power. So this is it for lesson 1.3, and in the next lesson, the last lesson of unit 1, we'll look at an example of soil destruction and talk about the potential of soil restoration. The example will be on the 1930s Dust Bowl that happened in the US, and it's a very interesting example of how rapidly soil can be destroyed and also the principles of soil restoration and how it was actually achieved to some level during the Dust Bowl and we're going to go through the principles of how we can achieve that, or what is required in order to begin the soil restoration process. Okay, you shall be hearing from me in lesson 1.4. Bye for now.